In 1933, a mild-mannered geography teacher fled Nazi Germany with nothing but a suitcase and a burning hatred for Adolf Hitler. Within a decade, this forgotten academic would train an army of secret agents who infiltrated the highest levels of the Third Reich, stealing plans that would turn the tide of World War II. His name was Wilhelm Schneider, and this is the story of how one man's obsession with maps became Hitler's worst nightmare. But here's the twist that history forgot. Schneider wasn't just any teacher. He had been Hitler's own geography instructor at a Munich gymnasium in 1908, and he remembered the angry young artist with disturbing clarity. The failed student who couldn't locate France on a map would one day try to conquer it, and Schneider would use that intimate knowledge of Hitler's weaknesses to bring down the entire Third Reich. This is not a story you'll find in textbooks. The British government kept it classified for 42 years. The agents Schneider trained went to their graves without speaking publicly about their missions. But now, piecing together declassified documents, personal letters, and testimony from the few surviving members of his network, we can finally tell the complete story of the teacher who turned geography into the deadliest weapon of World War II. Chapter 1. The Teacher Who Remembered Munich, 1908. Wilhelm Schneider stood before his classroom of 30 teenage boys, pointing at a hand-drawn map of Europe with his wooden pointer. The autumn light filtered through tall windows, illuminating dust motes and the faces of students who ranged from eager to openly hostile. Most paid attention. Schneider was known as a demanding but fair instructor. But one sullen youth in the back corner sketched obsessively in his notebook instead of taking notes. His name was Adolf Hitler, and he was failing geography for the second time. Schneider had taught for 15 years by then, and he prided himself on reaching even the most difficult students. But Hitler confounded him. The boy clearly had intelligence. His drawings showed genuine artistic talent, and when he did speak in class, he demonstrated a sharp if undisciplined mind, but he seemed to view education with contempt, as if learning facts about the world was beneath him. "Herr Hitler," Schneider called out one October morning, "perhaps you can tell the class the capital of France?" Hitler looked up from his sketches with barely concealed irritation. "Paris," he said flatly. "And can you point to it on the map?" Hitler stood slowly, walked to the front of the classroom, and after a long, uncomfortable pause, pointed to a spot that was actually Lyon. Laughter erupted from his classmates. Hitler's face flushed red, and Schneider saw something dangerous flash in the boy's eyes. Not embarrassment, but rage. After class, Schneider pulled Hitler aside in the empty corridor. The school smelled of chalk dust and floor wax. "Adolf," he said gently, "you have potential. Your mind is quick. But you waste it on fantasies and resentment. The world is bigger than your anger, and it operates by rules, geography, economics, resources. If you don't learn those rules, the world will crush you." Hitler's response would echo in Schneider's memory for the rest of his life. The boy looked at him with absolute certainty and said, "You're wrong, Herr Schneider. The world doesn't have rules. The world has weak men who make rules, and strong men who break them. One day, the world will learn to fit my vision, not the other way around." Schneider felt a chill run down his spine. He had met difficult students before, but this was different. This was pathological. He wrote a note in Hitler's file. "Intelligent, but fundamentally disordered in his thinking, sees the world not as it is, but as he wishes it to be. Unless corrected, this could lead to serious delusions." The note went nowhere. Hitler failed geography again, dropped out of school, and disappeared into Vienna's underworld of failed artists and radical politics. Schneider forgot about him, buried under thousands of other students in a long career. 25 years later, Schneider stood in his university office watching stormtroopers march through Munich's streets. Adolf Hitler, that failed, angry boy, was now Chancellor of Germany, and Schneider's blood ran cold as he realized the boy had never learned to see the world as it actually was. Now he had an entire nation to reshape according to his delusions. By then, Schneider was 63, a respected professor at Munich University, known throughout Europe for his groundbreaking work in military cartography and terrain analysis. His textbooks were used by officers in a dozen armies. His expertise had made him invaluable to German military planners during the Great War, helping to identify defensible positions and plan artillery placements. But now that same expertise made him dangerous to the Nazi regime. The purge came swiftly. In November 1933, SA officers burst into his university office during a lecture. "Jewish sympathizer!" they spat, though Schneider wasn't Jewish. His crime was simpler and more damning. He had publicly criticized the new Nazi geography curriculum for replacing scientific analysis with racial pseudoscience. He had written a letter to a colleague calling the regime's living space theories geographically illiterate fantasy. Someone had informed on him. Someone always did. They gave him 24 hours to leave Munich. His daughter Marie, a brilliant psychology student, helped him pack. His wife Clara, whose hands shook as she folded clothes, kept asking what they would do in England with no money and no prospects. Schneider could only tell her they would survive. They had to. As they boarded the train to Paris, then London, Schneider looked back at the city where he had taught for 30 years. He thought his career was over, his life's work destroyed by a student he'd once tried to help. He was wrong. His war against Adolf Hitler was about to begin in earnest, and this time he would be teaching students who actually listened. Chapter 2. The Spy Master's Recruitment, London, 1934. Wilhelm Schneider discovered that exile tastes like coal smoke and shame. His family lived in a cramped two-room flat in Bloomsbury, sharing a bathroom with 3 other refugee families. The famous Professor Schneider, author of 6 textbooks, advisor to generals, member of the Bavarian Academy of Sciences, now survived on odd translation jobs and tutoring wealthy children who couldn't find Belgium on a map. Clara took in sewing. Marie found work as a typist, her Cambridge psychology degree worthless in a city drowning in refugees. At night, Schneider lay awake, listening to his wife cry softly in the dark, and he burned with a hatred so intense it frightened him. Not just hatred for Hitler, but for his own helplessness. He was not a violent man. He was a teacher. What could a 64-year-old geography professor possibly do against the Nazi war machine? The answer arrived on a gray March morning in 1936, in the form of Colonel Stuart Menzies. Menzies appeared at the door in civilian clothes, an expensive suit that marked him as someone important, someone who didn't need to advertise his authority. He was 46, aristocratic, with the kind of confidence that came from generations of breeding and the absolute certainty that he belonged wherever he chose to be. "Professor Schneider, I wonder if you might spare me an hour of your time." Over tea in their shabby kitchen, Menzies came directly to the point. "I've read your papers on defensive terrain analysis, particularly your 1916 study on the Siegfried Line fortifications. Brilliant work. Tell me, Professor, do you still hate the Nazis?" Schneider set down his cup carefully. "Every single day, every single moment." "Good. Then let me ask you something else." Menzies leaned forward. "Would you be willing to train British agents to think like German military planners? To see Europe through German eyes, not as propaganda, but as strategic reality?" Schneider's heart raced. His mind was already racing ahead, seeing possibilities. "You want me to teach spies?" "I want you to create them," Menzies corrected. "We can recruit brave men and women all day long. The empire is full of patriots willing to die for king and country. Courage is common. But understanding how the enemy thinks, truly thinks, about space, movement, resources, terrain, that's rare. And that's what wins wars. I'm an old man. You're a man who knew Adolf Hitler personally, who taught him, who saw his weaknesses firsthand." Menzies pulled out a folder. "I've done my research, Professor. That note you wrote in Hitler's student file sees the world not as it is, but as he wishes it to be. That's not just insight. That's intelligence gold. You understand how he thinks better than anyone alive. Schneider stared at the colonel. You've seen my personnel files from Munich? We have people inside Germany. Professor, not enough and not good enough. That's why I'm here. Menzies stood. I'm authorized to offer you a position training agents for insertion into Germany and occupied territories. You'll have a proper salary, housing for your family, and the opportunity to do something more valuable than tutoring spoiled children. You'll be fighting back. When would I start? How does tomorrow suit you? Within 2 weeks, Schneider found himself at a country estate in Hampshire called Wudden Hall. Officially, it didn't exist. The maps showed empty fields. The locals knew to keep away from the gated property where black cars came and went at odd hours. Inside, Britain was preparing for a war that most politicians still believed could be avoided. Schneider's first meeting with the training staff was tense. Military men looked at this elderly German professor with obvious skepticism. What could an academic possibly teach field agents about survival behind enemy lines? Major Christopher Danvers, a decorated Great War veteran in charge of combat training, was particularly dismissive. With all due respect, Professor, my men need to learn how to kill Germans, not diagram their topography. Schneider smiled thinly. Tell me, Major, in your experience, what percentage of agents fail not because they can't handle weapons, but because they can't pass as authentic Germans? Danvers frowned. Difficult to quantify? 73%, Schneider interrupted. I've read your casualty reports. Most of your agents are caught because they make small mistakes. Cultural errors, geographical ignorance, the wrong regional accent. They're playing dress-up as Germans, not thinking like Germans. That's why they die. The room went silent. You teach your agents to shoot straight and fight dirty. Excellent. Necessary, but I will teach them something more fundamental. I will teach them to become German officers, not imitate them, become them. So perfectly that the Gestapo itself will salute them in the street. Schneider's eyes hardened. And then, when they're deep inside the Reich, surrounded by true believers and fanatics, they'll use that perfect cover to tear down everything Hitler has built. Menzies, who had been watching quietly from the corner, smiled. Gentlemen, I believe the professor has made his point. Professor Schneider, you have carte blanche to design your curriculum. Whatever you need, you'll have. Schneider nodded slowly. In his mind, he was already building something unprecedented. Not a spy school, but a factory for manufacturing perfect Germans who would serve the crown. Hitler had expelled him from Munich. Now he would send Hitler a graduation gift. An army of ghosts who looked German, thought German, and dreamed German, but whose souls belonged to the Allies. The teacher had found his classroom again, and this time his students would change the world. Chapter 3. The School for Perfect Germans, Wudden Hall, January 1937. Snow covered the grounds of the estate, muffling sound and creating an eerie isolation perfect for secrets. Wilhelm Schneider stood before his first class of 12 agents in what had once been the Manor's ballroom. Chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, but the polished floors were now marked with maps, and the walls were covered in photographs of German cities, landscapes, and military installations. The 12 students, 8 men, 4 women, ranged from 22 to 38 years old. Some were British-born with German ancestry. Others were refugees who had escaped the Reich and wanted revenge. All had been vetted extensively by MI6. All spoke fluent German. All believed they were ready for anything. They were wrong. Good morning, Schneider began in perfect Hochdeutsch. For the next 6 months, we will speak only German. Not English German, not textbook German, but the German of officers, bureaucrats, and true believers. If I hear you speak English even once, even in your sleep, you will be dismissed from this program. Is that understood? Nods around the room. Good. Now introduce yourselves. Tell me your name, your region of origin, and your father's profession. The students began. My name is David Evans. I'm from... Stop. Schneider held up his hand. You just failed. Your name is not David Evans, not anymore. That man is dead. You are now Friedrich Hartmann from Dresden, son of a railway engineer, educated at the Kreuzschule. Friedrich exists. He's real. He died in a factory accident in 1935, and we have obtained his papers. You are now him. So introduce yourself again, and this time, be Friedrich. Not an actor playing Friedrich. Actually be him. The man who had been David Evans swallowed hard. My name is Friedrich Hartmann. Where in Dresden did you live? I don't... Wrong answer. Friedrich knows every street in his neighborhood. He remembers the smell of his mother's kitchen, the sound of trams on Prager Strasse, the taste of Dresdner Stollen at Christmas. You need to know these things so deeply that you dream in Friedrich's memories. Because one day, a Gestapo officer might ask you a casual question about your childhood, and if you hesitate for even 1 second, you're dead. The classroom fell silent. These were not the lessons they expected. Schneider's curriculum was unlike anything British intelligence had ever attempted. While other instructors at Wadden Hall taught weapons handling, codes, radio operation, and tradecraft, Schneider taught his students to become their cover identities at a cellular level. Classes began at 5 in the morning with what Schneider called terrain reading. He would blindfold his students, drive them in a covered truck to random locations in the English countryside, remove the blindfolds, and demand they identify their position using only landscape features, vegetation patterns, soil quality, and architectural styles. A German officer knows instinctively whether ground is defensible, Schneider explained during one freezing February morning session. The students stood in a muddy field, shivering. He can estimate distances without measuring tools, identify soil quality at a glance, predict where water sources lie, and understand how terrain shapes battle. This isn't mysticism. It's training. It's seeing the land the way generals see it. One student, a young woman named Ruth Bergman who had fled Germany after her family was murdered, raised her hand. Professor, how does this help us spy? Surely we'll be in cities, not battlefields. Cities are battlefields, Schneider replied. Look around you. What do you see? A field, some trees, a farmhouse. Wrong. You see a natural depression that could hide troops, trees that provide sight lines, a farmhouse that controls the intersection of 2 roads. You see the bones of the earth, the strategic skeleton beneath the surface. He turned to face the class. When you walk through Berlin or Munich, I want you to see that same skeleton. Where are the supply routes? Which buildings are defensible? Where would troops deploy during civil unrest? Think like the enemy, and you'll know what the enemy values. Know what they value, and you'll know where their secrets are kept. After terrain analysis came resource mapping, teaching agents to estimate a region's industrial capacity, agricultural output, and transportation efficiency just through observation. Schneider taught them to glance at railway schedules and calculate troop movements, to look at coal stockpiles and estimate factory output, to examine civilian clothing and determine rationing severity. Intelligence is everywhere, Schneider insisted. You don't need to steal documents if you can read reality. Then came strategic geography, where students learned to think like German general staff officers. Schneider had obtained actual Wehrmacht planning documents through MI6's contacts, and he used them to teach students how German military minds processed information. The German officer corps thinks in terms of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, Schneider lectured, pointing at a map of Poland. They fetishize speed, breakthrough, encirclement. They're brilliant at it. But this creates blind spots. They undervalue logistics, overestimate their mobility, and assume enemy collapse rather than planning for sustained resistance. Learn these patterns, and you can predict their decisions. But Schneider's most valuable contribution was psychological. He had known Hitler personally, and he used that knowledge ruthlessly. His daughter Marie, now 30, had become his assistant instructor. She had completed her psychology degree at Cambridge, and together they created an unprecedented program in enemy psychology. Marie taught agents how to read Nazi body language, navigate complex military hierarchies, exploit the regime's paranoia, and manipulate true believers without arousing suspicion. National Socialism is a religion, Marie explained during one session. It has rituals, sacred texts, heretics, and true believers. Learn its liturgy, and you can hide among the faithful. They practiced endless scenarios. How to respond when someone gives the Hitler salute. How to drink at a Nazi party function. How to discuss the war with fervent believers while gathering intelligence. How to express sufficient anti-Semitism to pass without becoming complicit in atrocities. This last part tormented Schneider. He was teaching people to mouth Nazi propaganda, to pretend hatred they didn't feel, to smile and nod while surrounded by evil. Some nights he couldn't sleep, haunted by the thought that he was creating monsters. But then he would remember Hitler's face in that Munich classroom, the certainty in the boy's eyes that the world would bend to his will, and Schneider would return to his classroom, teaching his students not just to spy, but to become perfect Germans who would use that perfection to destroy everything Hitler had built. By December 1937, Schneider's first class graduated. 12 students entered. 10 survived the training. Within 6 months, all 10 would be inserted into Nazi Germany. 6 would still be alive by 1945. But the intelligence they provided would help win the war. As he watched them leave Wooden Hall, carrying false papers and real courage, Schneider felt something he hadn't felt since fleeing Munich: hope. Hitler had expelled him from Germany. Now he was sending his best students back, and they would teach the Third Reich lessons the Führer had never learned. Chapter 4. Operation Cartographer, September 1939. War had finally come, and Wilhelm Schneider's network, codenamed Operation Cartographer by MI6, proved its worth immediately. While other intelligence networks struggled to penetrate Nazi Germany, Schneider's agents thrived because they didn't act like spies. They were Germans, living German lives, thinking German thoughts, and they gathered intelligence the way Schneider had taught them, by reading reality. One agent, Friedrich, the former Welsh coal miner's son, David Evans, had infiltrated the Reich Transportation Ministry in Berlin as an efficiency analyst. His cover was perfect: a mid-level bureaucrat obsessed with railway logistics, the kind of tedious functionary that even the Gestapo found boring. Friedrich attended ministry meetings, pored over railway schedules, and filed endless reports about track maintenance and engine deployment. But using Schneider's terrain analysis training, Friedrich could glance at train schedules and calculate German troop movements with frightening accuracy. He knew that certain types of rolling stock only moved military equipment. He understood that sudden changes in civilian rail service indicated military priorities. He could estimate division sizes based on locomotive allocation and predict offensive operations by studying coal distribution patterns. His reports, transmitted through a complex chain of dead drops and coded messages, allowed British intelligence to predict the invasion of Poland 3 days before it began. When Friedrich reported a massive reallocation of hospital trains to eastern Germany in late August 1939, MI6 analysts knew war was imminent. Another agent, Greta, Ruth Bergman, who had lost her family to Nazi brutality, worked as a secretary in the Army High Command, the OKH. Ruth had been hesitant to return to Germany. The country had murdered her parents, but her hatred was pure and focused. "I want to make them pay," she told Schneider before her insertion, "every single one of them." "Then you'll pay attention," Schneider had replied. Revenge is easy. Intelligence is hard. Make them pay by being the perfect secretary, the invisible woman they ignore, and while they ignore you, steal their secrets. Ruth didn't steal documents. That was too risky, too detectable. Instead, she used Schneider's resource mapping techniques to deduce German industrial capacity and military readiness by analyzing requisition orders, supply manifests, and internal memoranda. She understood that every army moves on logistics, and logistics leave paper trails. Her reports revealed something crucial. Germany was burning through resources faster than Goebbels' propaganda suggested. The Blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactical doctrine, it was a necessity. Germany couldn't sustain a long war because it lacked the industrial base and raw materials. This intelligence would prove vital in 1941 when Stalin needed convincing that the Soviet Union could survive the initial German onslaught. But Schneider's greatest success came from an unexpected source: his own reputation and Hitler's ignorance. In early 1940, the Wehrmacht's general staff recognized they had a problem. German officers were brilliant tacticians, but often poor strategic thinkers. They understood how to fight battles, but not always where to fight them. The Reich needed a comprehensive military geography training program, and they needed someone with impeccable academic credentials to design it. Several older Wehrmacht officers, men who had studied before the Nazis came to power, remembered Professor Wilhelm Schneider from his days at Munich University. His textbooks were still considered classics. His work on terrain analysis was unmatched. Yes, he had left Germany under unfortunate political circumstances, but surely the man needed money. Perhaps he could be persuaded to contribute to German military education, even from abroad, for the right price. An intermediary contacted Schneider through Swiss banking channels in March 1940. The proposal was straightforward: submit curriculum designs for the new Wehrmacht military geography program. No one needed to know he was living in London. They assumed he was desperate, destitute, and apolitical enough to take their money. Schneider read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. Then he started to laugh. Marie found him in his office at Wooden Hall, tears streaming down his face, laughing until he couldn't breathe. "Papa, what is it? What's wrong?" "They want me to teach them," he gasped between laughs. "Hitler's generals want me to design their geography curriculum. They're asking the man they exiled to tell them how to see the world." Marie's eyes widened. "Can you—" "Oh, yes." Schneider's laughter stopped abruptly. His face went cold. "Yes, I can, and I will teach them exactly what they need to know, with one small adjustment." For 3 weeks, Schneider worked 20-hour days crafting a comprehensive military geography curriculum for the Wehrmacht. It was brilliant, perhaps the best work of his career. It covered everything: terrain analysis, resource mapping, logistics planning, strategic assessment, weather prediction, and infrastructure evaluation. It was also subtly, carefully, almost imperceptibly flawed. Every map example, every terrain analysis problem, every strategic scenario was designed to reinforce specific blind spots in German strategic thinking. Schneider taught them to overvalue railway networks while underestimating sea transport, to see rivers as barriers rather than supply routes, to calculate distances based on peacetime conditions rather than combat reality, to think in terms of rapid offensive warfare rather than sustained occupation and defense. Most insidiously, he taught them to see the Soviet Union the way Hitler saw it, as vast but empty space, primitive, and easily conquered. The curriculum examples consistently used outdated Russian maps, underestimated distances, and assumed European-style infrastructure that didn't exist in the Soviet interior. "This is the Siegfried Line in reverse," Marie observed, reading over his shoulder. "Instead of building defenses, you're building intellectual weaknesses." "Precisely," Schneider replied. "Every student who learns this curriculum will be slightly worse at strategic thinking than they would otherwise be. They won't know it, The errors are too subtle, too embedded in the examples and assumptions. But when they plan operations, they'll make predictable mistakes, and our side will know exactly what mistakes to expect. The Wehrmacht adopted Schneider's curriculum almost entirely. By mid-1940, it was being taught at military academies throughout the Reich. Schneider was even paid a substantial sum in Swiss francs that he immediately donated to refugee organizations. He was training the enemy to see the war exactly the way he wanted them to see it. And when Operation Barbarossa launched in June 1941, German officers using Schneider's curriculum made exactly the mistakes he had programmed into them. They underestimated distances, overestimated their supply capabilities, assumed rapid Soviet collapse, and planned for a campaign that would be over before winter. It wasn't over before winter. The Russian winter came early that year, and German troops, trained to think of weather as a tactical inconvenience rather than a strategic factor, were completely unprepared. They froze in summer uniforms because their logistics training had taught them to prioritize ammunition over winter clothing. Schneider had taught them geography, but he had taught them just poorly enough to kill them. Chapter 5. The Teacher's Greatest Students. By 1942, Wilhelm Schneider's network had expanded to over 80 agents operating throughout German-occupied Europe. But 3 students stood out as his masterpieces, proof that his methods could create agents so perfect that even the most paranoid regime couldn't detect them. The first was Klaus Richter, though that wasn't his real name. Even Schneider never learned his true identity. MI6 had recruited him from the Special Operations Executive and buried his past so deeply that no amount of Gestapo investigation could uncover it. Klaus had trained with Schneider in 1938, and by 1941 he had infiltrated so deeply into the Wehrmacht that he was now a major in Army Group Center, advising on defensive positions on the Eastern Front. Klaus was a genius at Schneider's terrain analysis techniques. He could look at a map and immediately identify weak points, places where Soviet forces could penetrate German lines, where supply routes were vulnerable, where defensive positions were poorly sighted. His job was to fix these weaknesses. Instead, he reported them to Moscow through circuitous channels while pretending to address them. The result was subtle, but devastating. German defensive lines had hidden vulnerabilities that Klaus had deliberately left unaddressed. When Soviet forces attacked, they somehow always found the gaps. German command blamed fog of war and Soviet luck. They never suspected that their own staff officer was guiding enemy attacks like a malevolent conductor. Klaus's most significant contribution came in autumn 1942, when he was assigned to review defensive positions around Stalingrad. Using Schneider's methods, he identified the weak Romanian and Italian sectors on the flanks of the German Sixth Army, positions that were under-fortified, poorly supplied, and would collapse under concentrated assault. Instead of reinforcing these positions, Klaus wrote reports suggesting they were adequate. He praised Romanian readiness and recommended shifting resources to other sectors. His reports were believed because Klaus was brilliant, because his previous analyses had been flawless, and because no one suspected that a German major might be serving Soviet interests. When Operation Uranus launched on November 19, 1942, Soviet forces smashed through exactly the positions Klaus had identified. The German Sixth Army was encircled, and Stalingrad became the turning point of the war. Klaus had taught the Germans geography, but he had taught them to ignore the one lesson that mattered most. He was discovered in August 1943, betrayed by a secretary who noticed him burning papers. The Gestapo arrested him, tortured him for 3 weeks, and executed him by firing squad. He never revealed his network, never admitted his true identity, and died with Schneider's lessons embedded so deeply in his mind that even torture couldn't extract them. The second student was Anna Schmidt, known to the network as the cartographer's daughter, though she wasn't Marie Schneider's daughter, just an agent trained by her. Anna had been a German Olympic athlete in 1936, a swimmer who had won bronze in Berlin while internally recoiling at the Nazi spectacle around her. She defected to Britain in 1937 and volunteered for intelligence work, driven by shame at what her country had become. Schneider recognized her potential immediately. "You're famous in Germany," he told her during their first meeting. "That makes you the perfect spy. No one suspects celebrities. They're too visible to be subversive." Anna's cover was perfect. She returned to Germany in 1938 as a sports instructor for the League of German Girls, the female equivalent of the Hitler Youth. Her job required her to travel extensively throughout the Reich, teaching navigation skills and physical fitness to teenage girls. In reality, she was mapping every military installation, factory, and strategic resource she encountered. Using Schneider's observational techniques, Anna could walk past a factory and estimate its production capacity. She could glance at rail sidings and determine what type of munitions were being transported. She could teach girls wilderness navigation while simultaneously noting every Luftwaffe airfield, army depot, and naval installation within 50 kilometers. Her reports provided targeting data for RAF bombing campaigns throughout 1940-1943. She identified the location of ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, and aircraft production facilities with such precision that British bombers could plan routes around heavy defenses and strike vulnerable targets. But Anna's greatest achievement came in 1943 when she was assigned to teach at a Hitler Youth camp near Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. She noticed unusual security, mysterious facilities, and strange rocket-shaped objects being transported under heavy guard. Using Schneider's deductive methods, she realized she had stumbled upon the V-2 rocket program. Her detailed reports on Peenemunde's layout, production facilities, and testing schedules enabled Operation Hydra, the massive RAF bombing raid on August 17-18, 1943, that set back V-2 development by months and saved thousands of British lives. Anna was arrested by the Gestapo in March 1944 after a network of agents was compromised by a double agent. She was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp and died there in January 1945, 3 months before liberation. She was 32 years old, but the third student was perhaps the most remarkable. And he wasn't one of Schneider's trained agents at all. His name was Hans Oster, and he was a genuine Nazi, or had been, until reality shattered his illusions. Oster was a German admiral and deputy head of the Abwehr, Hitler's military intelligence service. He had joined the Nazi Party in the early 1930s, a true believer in national renewal and German greatness. But by 1938, he had witnessed Hitler's recklessness, his contempt for military advice, his willingness to risk Germany's destruction for personal glory. Oster's patriotism remained, but it was now directed against Hitler, not for him. He began passing intelligence to the Allies in 1939, making contact with MI6 through intermediaries. When British intelligence connected him with Schneider's network, the old teacher recognized an extraordinary opportunity. Oster didn't need training in spycraft or terrain analysis. He was already at the heart of Nazi power. What he needed was strategic thinking that could help the Allies without revealing his betrayal. Schneider met with Oster once, secretly, in neutral Switzerland in 1940. It was dangerous and brief, but long enough for Schneider to teach Oster his most valuable skill: how to give Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear while subtly steering him toward strategic mistakes. "The Führer sees what he wants to see," Schneider explained. "He demands optimistic reports, aggressive plans, reassurance that his genius is infallible. Give him those things, but carefully, calculatedly wrong. Feed his delusions, reinforce his worst instincts, make him overconfident about Germany's strength and contemptuous of enemy capabilities." Oster took these lessons to heart. He became Hitler's enabler, the intelligence chief who told the Führer that Russia was weak, that America was decadent, that Britain was defeated, that German will could overcome any material disadvantage. And Hitler, who demanded validation rather than truth, believed every word. The result was catastrophic for Germany. Hitler made decisions based on intelligence reports that Oster had carefully distorted, reports that reinforced his overconfidence, his contempt for defensive warfare, his belief that willpower could triumph over logistics. Operation Barbarossa was planned with absurdly optimistic assumptions about Soviet weakness and German mobility. The invasion of the Soviet Union proceeded on a timetable that Oster knew was impossible, but Hitler insisted was achievable. Oster was discovered after the failed July 20, 1944 assassination attempt against Hitler. He had been peripherally involved, and the subsequent Gestapo investigation uncovered evidence of his treason. He was arrested, tortured, and on April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, he was hanged with piano wire on Hitler's personal orders. His greatest service to the Allies was never discovered. The Nazis executed him as a traitor who passed documents to the enemy. They never realized he had been feeding Hitler carefully crafted lies designed to destroy German strategy from within. Oster had learned Schneider's lessons perfectly. See the world as it is, understand your enemy's delusions, and use that knowledge to make them destroy themselves. 3 students, 3 different methods, all trained by Schneider to see the world clearly and use that clarity as a weapon. Klaus read terrain and found weaknesses. Anna read industrial capacity and called down fire from the sky. Oster read Hitler's psychology and fed his delusions until they consumed him. They were the teacher's masterpieces, and they helped topple an empire. Chapter 6. The Price of Victory, May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. London erupted in celebration. Crowds filled Trafalgar Square, church bells rang across the city, strangers embraced in the streets, and King George VI appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to wave at the jubilant masses below. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had fallen. Wilhelm Schneider sat alone in his small office at Wooden Hall, staring at photographs of his former students spread across his desk. 47 faces looked back at him from graduation photos, training exercises, and candid moments when they had still been alive and full of hope. He had trained them. He had sent them into hell, and 19 of them had never come back. The office was quiet except for the distant sound of celebration drifting through the open window. Schneider was 75 years old now, his hair completely white, his hands shaking slightly as he touched each photograph. Klaus Richter, discovered and executed in 1943. Anna Schmidt, dead in Ravensbrück in January, just months before liberation. Hans Oster, hanged with piano wire in April, days before Germany's surrender. Others, too. Friedrich, the Welsh miner's son who had infiltrated the transportation ministry, caught in a Gestapo sweep in 1942 and shot while trying to escape. Margaret, a brilliant Austrian linguist, betrayed by an informant and executed in 1943. Stefan, Eric, Sophia, names and faces, each representing a life he had shaped and sent to destruction. The door opened quietly. Marie entered, now 43 years old, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of whiskey. She had aged during the war, they all had, but there was steel in her spine that hadn't been there in 1933. She had trained dozens of agents herself, taught them psychology and manipulation, and watched too many of them die. "Papa," she said softly, sitting beside him, "the war is over. We won." "Did we?" Schneider gestured at the photographs. 19 dead. 19 people I trained who trusted me, who believed I was preparing them for survival. I sent them to their deaths. Marie poured whiskey into both glasses, her hand steady. "You sent them to fight. There's a difference. They knew the risks. They volunteered. They volunteered because I made them believe they could succeed. I gave them confidence, skills, training. I made them perfect Germans so they could hide among monsters. And then the monsters found them anyway. He picked up Anna Schmidt's photograph, her bright smile, her Olympic bronze medal visible in the image. She was 32, Marie. She survived the regime, the war, only to die in a camp 3 months before liberation. What was the point? The point, Marie said firmly, is what they accomplished. You want to talk about Anna? Fine. Let's talk about her. Her intelligence on Peenemünde delayed the V2 program by months. Do you know how many Londoners would have died if those rockets had been operational earlier? Thousands, tens of thousands. Anna saved them. She picked up another photograph. Klaus Richter. His intelligence contributed to the encirclement at Stalingrad. That was the turning point of the entire Eastern Front. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives saved because one man knew where the weaknesses were and guided Soviet forces to exploit them. Schneider shook his head. You're calculating lives like resources on a map. These were people, not chess pieces. You think I don't know that? Marie's voice cracked slightly. I trained 12 agents myself. 4 are dead. I remember their faces, their voices, their fears. I remember Sophia crying the night before her insertion because she was terrified of torture. I remember holding her hand and lying to her, telling her everything would be fine. And then she was captured and tortured for 3 weeks before they executed her. So don't lecture me about the cost, Papa. I paid it too. They sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the celebrations continued. A country rejoicing that the nightmare was finally over, that their children would grow up without air raids and rationing and the constant fear of invasion. The intelligence they provided changed history, Marie continued quietly. Your network contributed to predicting German invasion routes in France, to identifying weaknesses in Atlantic Wall defenses before D-Day, to mapping V2 production facilities, to understanding German oil shortages that crippled the Wehrmacht, to providing terrain analysis that helped Soviet forces encircle German armies. Papa, your students helped win the war. At what cost to their souls? Schneider asked. I taught them to become perfect Nazis, to mouth propaganda, to give the Hitler salute, to pretend hatred they didn't feel. Some of them had to do terrible things to maintain their cover. Friedrich once told me he attended an SS execution and had to smile and applaud to avoid suspicion. How do you live with that? How do they live with that? They live with it because the alternative was worse, Marie replied. They saw what the Reich was doing. They knew about the camps, the mass murders, the systematic destruction of entire peoples. And they chose to fight, even if fighting meant compromising themselves. That's not weakness, Papa. That's courage. There was a knock at the door. Both Schneiders looked up to see Colonel Menzies, now Sir Stuart Menzies, chief of MI6, standing in the doorway in full-dress uniform, medals gleaming. He had aged during the war, too, his hair graying, new lines around his eyes. But he carried himself with the same authority he had shown in that cramped Bloomsbury flat 9 years earlier. Professor Schneider, Menzies said quietly. May I have a moment? Schneider gestured to a chair. Menzies sat, removed his cap, and looked at the photographs spread across the desk. He recognized some of the faces. I came to thank you, Menzies said, and to tell you something that's still classified, but I think you deserve to know. Operation Cartographer, your network, was the most successful intelligence operation of the entire war. Not the most dramatic, not the one that will get movies made about it, but the most consistently valuable. Your agents provided intelligence that shaped strategic decisions at the highest levels. Churchill himself read your network's reports. Stalin's generals used your terrain analyses. Eisenhower's planning for D-Day relied on your students' observations of Atlantic Wall defenses. Schneider said nothing, just stared at the photographs. You trained 87 agents over 9 years, Menzies continued. 19 were killed in action. That's a casualty rate of 22%. Do you know what the average casualty rate was for agents inserted into Nazi Germany? 68%. Your students survived because you taught them properly. You gave them the skills to pass as Germans so perfectly that most of them completed their entire missions and came home alive. Most, Schneider said bitterly. Not all. No, Menzies agreed. Not all. War doesn't offer that option, Professor. We sent hundreds of thousands of young men to die in France, in Africa, in the Atlantic. We sent children, 18-year-old boys, to burn alive in bombers over Germany. Your 19 agents were volunteers, highly trained, who died doing work that saved thousands of others. That doesn't make their deaths less tragic, but it does give them meaning. Schneider finally looked up at Menzies. Will anyone ever know what they did? Will there be memorials, recognition, gratitude? Probably not, Menzies admitted. This work stays classified for decades. Their families think they died in accidents or disappeared. The truth dies with us, I'm afraid. That's the price of secrecy. So they died anonymous, Schneider said. Heroes no one will remember. Heroes you will remember, Marie interjected. We will remember, Papa, every one of them. We'll carry their names, their faces, their courage. That has to be enough. Outside, the celebrations grew louder. Someone was singing God Save the King, voices full of joy and relief and exhaustion. Menzies stood, preparing to leave. One more thing, Professor. Churchill has authorized me to offer you a position as senior advisor to MI6's Geographical Analysis Division. Full salary, pension, recognition of your contributions. The work would be less dangerous. Training peacetime analysts, consulting on strategic assessments. You've earned retirement, but if you want to continue... No, Schneider interrupted. No more training agents. No more sending people into danger. I'm done. Menzies nodded, unsurprised. I understand. Then let me say this. You changed the course of history. Professor Schneider, Hitler expelled you from Munich because you represented everything he hated. Truth, precision, the idea that reality has rules that can't be bent by willpower alone. And you used that exile to build a weapon that helped destroy him. Your students saw the world clearly, taught the enemy to see it incorrectly, and exploited that difference. That's not just espionage. That's genius. After Menzies left, Schneider and Marie sat together in silence, drinking whiskey and looking at photographs. Eventually, Marie spoke. Do you remember what Hitler said to you in 1908, in that classroom in Munich? Schneider nodded. The world will learn to fit my vision, not the other way around. And what did you tell your students on their first day of training? Schneider allowed himself a small smile. The map is not the territory. Reality doesn't care about your dreams. You spent your whole life teaching people to see the world as it actually is, Marie said. Hitler spent his life trying to force reality to match his fantasies. In the end, reality won. You won. They sat together until the celebrations outside began to fade, until the sun set over London, until the photographs on the desk were illuminated only by lamplight. Schneider touched each face one more time. Klaus, Anna, Hans, Friedrich, all the others. 19 names, 19 lives, 19 students who had learned his lessons and paid the ultimate price. But they had won. Hitler was dead, the Reich was rubble, and the maps showed the truth again. Epilogue. Wilhelm Schneider died peacefully in his sleep on March 15, 1951, at the age of 81. His obituary in the Times mentioned his distinguished career as a geographer, his service to Britain during the war, but gave no details. The full story of Operation Cartographer remained classified until 1987, 36 years after his death. Marie Schneider continued working in intelligence analysis until 1952, then became a professor of psychology at Oxford University. She never married, never spoke publicly about her wartime work, but quietly mentored several generations of students in the art of understanding how people think. She died in 1989, having lived long enough to see Operation Cartographer declassified and her father finally recognized as one of the war's unsung heroes. Of the 87 agents Schneider trained, 68 survived the war. They scattered across the world afterward, some staying in Britain, others emigrating to America, Canada, Australia. They took normal jobs, raised families, grew old. Most never told their children the truth about what they had done between 1939 and 1945. But many became geography teachers. In classrooms from London to Sydney, from Toronto to Cape Town, Schneider's former students taught new generations of children how to read maps, understand terrain, see the strategic skeleton beneath the surface. They taught that geography matters, that the map is not the territory, that reality has rules that can't be bent by willpower or ideology. They taught, in other words, the lessons that might have saved the world from Adolf Hitler if only he had been willing to learn them in 1908. In 1995, a small memorial was erected at Wadden Hall, which had been converted into a technology park. The plaque reads, "In memory of the agents of Operation Cartographer, 1937-1945. They saw the world clearly, taught the enemy to see it falsely, and used that difference to defend freedom. 19 gave their lives. All served with honor." Below the inscription are 19 names. No ranks, no details, just names. Klaus Richter, Anna Schmidt, Hans Oster, Friedrich Hartmann, Margarete Weber, and 14 others whose stories have been lost to time and secrecy. Wilhelm Schneider's final lesson was this: geography is destiny, but only for those who refuse to see it clearly. Hitler believed the world would bend to his vision. Schneider knew that the world doesn't bend. It breaks those who ignore its reality. In the end, a failed student who couldn't find France on a map tried to conquer it, and a teacher who had been expelled for telling the truth trained an army of perfect Germans who used truth as a weapon. The student died in a bunker, his empire in ruins. The teacher died in his sleep, surrounded by maps that showed the world as it actually was. History, like geography, has its own rules. And one of them is this: reality always wins in the end.